this chapter, Chapter 13, Planning and Preparing a Final Research Report, we'll discuss how you put together a final research report. Although there will only be certain sections that you will be completing for the purpose of this course, we'll talk about the research report in its entirety. If you go to D2L, and you can maybe pause, open another window as we discuss this. On D2L, I posted a list of the elements of a research report. It's called Parts of an APA Style Research Proposal, and it's under Assignments. And on that link, you will see the parts of the APA Style Research Proposal that you will be completing in this class. You will complete a title page, an abstract, an introduction, and then there I have listed the parts of the introduction, a method section, and a reference list. An entire research report would also include, following the method section, a results section and a discussion section. Since we are only proposing a project in this course and not actually conducting it, we do not have results to report, and therefore we do not have a discussion to report, which would then talk about the implications of the results that you found, as well as some indications for practice as well as future research. Okay, so now, Chapter 13. To get started on your report, you have to identify the guidelines and requirements, identify the style used in this discipline. In our discipline, it's APA style. If you are not familiar with the APA style, this is a good time to maybe either find a resource that you can access easily at the library if that's convenient for you. If it's not convenient for you, I would definitely recommend that you pick up a copy of the APA Manual 6th edition. I did not make it a requirement of this course. However, if you will be writing a thesis or dissertation, you'll definitely need one, so it would be a good purchase. If you won't, then just make sure that you have access to one at your local library. Hopefully, if you can get to the USD library, I know they have one in stock in the reference section. If not, I would definitely recommend purchasing one. The information is also under assignments on D2L. Search for and read general writing tips. It always is beneficial to find writing tips. Just like in English writing classes, researchers also have writing blocks, and there's a process that we need to go through. And that's why I created the assignments in steps, so that step 1, we're writing the outline, coming up with some ideas, pulling together a literature review, having an annotated bibliography where we get the key elements of each individual article that's contributing to our paper, and so that helps you with the process. But we all have our unique writing style, and it never hurts to find some general writing tips. Look at others' reports and identify both good and not so good features. Even in published journal articles, I can find examples of quality and not quality reports. And there are several key components that we're going to discuss in this chapter that should be found in a good quality research report. Main objective: give the reader a clear understanding of the research problem and why it merits investigation. And this is the heart of your introduction. Here you should have some sort of thesis of what it is that you plan to accomplish. So you start out with a really strong opening statement to set the stage for your paper. By the end of that first paragraph, you then have a good solid thesis statement that doesn't give the reader your hypotheses yet. We save that for the end of the introduction, but it sets the stage for what it is that you're proposing. In each subsequent paragraph, it's important also to have good segue ending sentences for each paragraph, as well as good solid topic sentences that begin each paragraph. So make sure that there's a cohesiveness of narrative between your paragraphs. One of the most common pitfalls in first research reports, in writing your first research report, if this happens to be your first one, is that when we're reporting the literature, I have students at all levels who just summarize the findings from previous studies without linking it directly to what it is that you want to do. And so again, the main objective, and let's read this again from the PowerPoint, is to give readers a clear understanding of the research problem and why it merits investigation. So one hand, you're stating the research problem. On the other hand, you're substantiating why it merits investigation with what has previously been found in the literature. The second main objective is to find and to describe your methodology, describe your methods. How will you carry out this study? Who are your participants? What is the setting in which this study will take place? What measures, scales, materials will you be using? So you want to be really specific about all of those steps in your method section. And then if you were to, and you won't do this in your proposal, but if you were to carry out the study, you'd present the data precisely in your results section and completely to substantiate the interpretations and conclusions. Those interpretations and conclusions would then be provided in the discussion section. Again, we will not in this course be completing the results in the discussion section, but it is important to point out that those are elements of a research report. When you do actually conduct a study. Okay, some more main objectives. Interpret the data for readers, linking the data to the research problem. And this is where we not only report our results in the results section, that's where you state your findings. You would conduct your statistical analyses based on your research questions and or hypotheses. And then in your discussion section, you would interpret, well, what do these numbers mean? And what are the implications for practice and for future research? And sometimes, you know, our findings, our results would support our hypotheses, and sometimes they won't. And so in both instances, that's valuable information. It's an unethical thing is to just say, okay, we're not going to even report these findings that did not show statistical significance. There's actually a great NPR clip on that, on the ethics of not reporting insignificant findings. And if you're interested in that, I can give you more information on that. I'll give you the link. It's important to report both sides, because if we didn't find what we expected to find, then we need to explain that as well. So that's just something to keep in mind that a lot of people don't think about. We also have to alert readers to the possible weaknesses of our study. So we call those generally the limitations of our study. What are some of the limitations? Well, maybe a limitation is that I was not able to gather a random or representative sample. That would be a limitation, and so we would report those limitations so that our reader understands our study a little bit better and who was in our study and who does this apply to and who does it not apply to. We need to summarize the findings and connect them to the context beyond the study itself. So we can say, okay, we found this in this context in the school environment. We can then try to say, does this apply to the home environment? You know, extracurricular activities, you know, setting. What other environments does this study apply to? And it might extend beyond the setting in which it was conducted, it might not, and you need to explain that. Explanation of the research problem. You want to state the main purpose, create a meeting of the minds between the writer and the readers of the report. And that's where we always have to take into account who is our audience and make sure that we're presenting it in a way that is comprehensible to our audience. If we're using technical terminologies, did we define those terms so that they're clear? As we stated in one of the earlier PowerPoints, the operational definition. Did we utilize operational definitions that are very clear to our reader how we defined it in this study? So there's nothing wrong with having a unique way in which you define it as long as you're very clear to your audience about how it is defined in this study. Because even something that we all might have somewhat of a similar definition of, so for example, depression, we might all say, okay, well, one of those, the adjectives would be, you know, sadness, maybe negative mood, things of that nature, and then we can have some similar thoughts on that. But then we would want to know, well, how did you measure? Did you just ask them how sad they were? Was that enough of a of a measure to assess it? And there's a whole other body of tested measurements and looking at validity and reliability of studies of measures, and that's something you also want to consider is the way in which you're measuring this variable. So you operationalize it, but is it a valid measure? Meaning, does it measure what it purports to measure? Is it valid? And also, is it reliable? So would we find it over and over if we measured it over again? And if you've taken other psychology courses or research courses or test and measurements courses, you might have found that there's a whole body of different types of reliability and different types of validity. We can spend, several weeks on just looking at all those types. So it's a lot more in-depth, but just to give you an overview here, you want to make sure that your measures are reliable and valid and have some indication of that in your report. If you need help with that, you can always talk to me more about it. Now for the explanation of the research problem. Here you want to include a statement of the problem and the subproblems, the setting, why it's important, definition of key terms, and review of the related literature when necessary. Now here's where I want to state that there's some overlap between what's reported in the introduction and the methods to a certain extent, and I'll explain how that works. In your introduction section, you want to really thoroughly review the literature. So again, you start with that thesis statement, you have a cohesive narrative between your paragraphs with good title sentences and good segues at the end of each paragraph into the next paragraph that help you segue into the next paragraph. And in that, you will start to allude to what settings and who are your participants, and you'll start to survey the literature in that area. And you set the stage for why your hypothesis, which is at the end of your introduction, is important. In your method section, however, you're really being specific about the setting in which you will or you're proposing to conduct your study. You're really specific about your participants who will be in your study. You're really specific about the definition of terms. Recall that we discussed operational definitions. This is where it comes into play. Also, you want to take into account the validity and reliability of your measures. So do you have a valid and reliable measure? And there are so many different types of reliability and validity, some of which are beyond the scope of this course, but you need some type of measure of validity. Is it measuring what it's supposed to be measuring? And is it a reliable way of measuring this particular variable? And you need to support those two aspects. So we can talk about that more at an individual level if you have questions for your particular study, but that's something to definitely keep in mind. And then there's a review of the related literature when necessary in your method section. So for example, you would, in reporting what types of measures you're using, reference the study that used that measure and their reports of reliability and validity, and therefore justifying its use in your particular study. Description of the methods. So the methods section, you want to make sure that anyone who reads your study could then go and replicate your study. So it needs to include the type of design, the setting, the sample, the instruments, and the procedures. If you look again on D2L on your parts of your APA style paper, you'll see that I've asked you to have a method section. It has main parts. One is the description of participants. Another is the description of materials, and this is where you talk about your measures. And then finally, your procedure in enough detail that it could be replicated, including operational definitions of your variables. Description of data analysis. Here, I'm assuming that many of you may not have taken stats yet, so we will be limited in our discussion of analyses. At this point, if you're comfortable and you're really interested in writing a proposal for a results section, which would include the types of analysis that you might be using. I'm also a stats professor, and I'm more than happy to help you with that area. If you are, like I said, planning for a thesis or dissertation, I'm happy to help you with that as well. You know, make some headway on those projects. Why not, right? You have the opportunity to do that, and I'm happy to support you in that way. And here, if you were to do that, you would have to also support the rationale for the specific statistical approaches that you utilize. You need to report what it is that you found after you conduct your study, and then you also need to utilize the best way of summarizing and reporting those results. And sometimes it's in text, so within words, and then reporting it in APA format. Sometimes it's best supported with figures, tables. But what you want to know is that you don't want to ever duplicate information. So when you're reporting your findings, if it's reported in the text format, you don't want to report the same information in a table or figure. So you have to really choose one, and that's part of APA style requirement, is that you would choose one or the other. And then if you did include a table, another requirement would be that you have to reference it in text. So that's how you would report your data analysis. Interpretation of your data, this would come in your discussion section of your paper. You want to fully understand what it is that you found. So in your results section, you discuss your statistical analysis, so your actual findings. But here in your discussion section, you're now drawing conclusions about why you found what you found. Again, and I mentioned this earlier, you do not want to use the word prove. We just say that this study supported our hypothesis or failed to support it. And then always remember that in ethics that we need to be very honest about what the data actually revealed. We want to also be upfront in our discussion section about the weaknesses. So now at this point we've completed our study, and now we know some possible weaknesses. We need to be upfront about any assumptions or biases that we as researchers have that may have influenced our ability to be completely objective. And we also need to be precise about how far we can extend it, our delimitations. So it does apply to individuals who are similar to the individuals who were in our actual sample, but not to others. So those are some of the delimitations, the settings that it would be applicable to or not, or any other limitations that may have had you cast doubt on your findings. So for example, if one room was, you had two groups that you were comparing, and one room was given instructions in a very harsh way and the other from a very friendly person, and you would say, oh, well, now that we know that, we didn't know that going in, of course we would have tried to avoid that, but now that we know that, that might have influenced our findings. So anything that may have occurred during the study that we didn't anticipate beforehand, we'd want to explain those limitations in our summary. Summary and connections to broad context section or chapter that brings closure to the study. Again, our discussion section summarizes the finding and interpretations, answers the so what question. So what does this mean? What are the implications? How does this change what we do? Does it change what we do in any way? And how does our study contribute to our collective knowledge? So if you recall from the first chapter, we had that diagram. I love that diagram showing how research process is cyclical. And how it leans on each other and informs future research, and it's based on past research. And so that's where this comes into play. How does our study contribute to the collective knowledge base? We always want to make sure to be ethical in all of our procedures before the study, during the study, following the study, reporting results, etc. We want to convey only the truth as we know it, not try to stretch the truth in any way. This is also part of academic integrity. We have internal review boards, human subjects review boards that protect the use of human participants, but we also have them to help us protect some of the other ethics. If you're going to conduct a study, you'll probably be asked to complete a training that is a nationally recognized training that allows you to go through all of the steps of learning of the ethics of not just conducting a study, but also of reporting those results and what's appropriate. We want to make sure that we're crediting appropriately. So the use of APA style in quotes and references is not just a style issue, but it's also an ethical issue. So if we're not appropriately crediting our sources, if we're paraphrasing without giving them credit, that's an ethical problem, an academic integrity issue that we really need to be careful of. So that's all part of the maintaining academic integrity, is making sure that we're citing properly. Again, it's not just a style issue, it's an ethical issue. Maintaining confidentiality in education and psychology and maybe in some of your other fields. We're using human participants, and we want to make sure that all of their responses are confidential, that we can't track back to their individual identities in any way, and we want to protect human subjects as best possible. If you recall, if you've ever taken a Psych 101 and Psych 100 course in your undergraduate, you might recall, the Milgram experiments or the Baby Albert experiments, and if you haven't, you can look those up online and to see why we need those human subject review boards to protect individuals. Very important. So those are some of the examples before we had IRBs and internal review boards, and why those became so important. And again, we want to identify any biases we had in our sample selection as well. Also, in line with academic integrity, there are times when we need to eliminate a participant from the study. Perhaps they only filled out half of the survey, they left in the middle. We can't simply just omit their data. We can exclude them from analyses, but it would not be ethical to just simply pretend like they were never in this study. We would have to say in our report that there were 3 participants out of 100 that only completed half of the survey or who decided to leave midway, and we need to explain why as best we can. And that is also a limitation in our study. We also have to describe any limitations of the way in which we measured our variables. Sometimes after you look at a survey and you think that it's, the best that you could have done, you try to think of all possible limitations, and we don't think of everything necessarily, and then we go into it and we have participants say, well, this wording was really confusing and I didn't really know what you meant. That would be a limitation of your measurement. You tried to anticipate it, but then you didn't, that just happens sometimes. And then we need to explain that following our study. We also want to describe any procedures to fill in missing data points. There are some statistical procedures that we can use when we do have omissions of data. So if we have a certain percentage of data from a participant, we can sometimes compute an average for the ones that are missing instead of computing zeros for those items that they skipped. So sometimes there's just human error and they missed an item or two, and then instead of just completely omitting that individual from our study, we can extrapolate and say, well, on average, there's, they were rating this as a 5 out of 6, and so then we can add that 5 to that item that they accidentally skipped. But if we do that, we can't just simply go ahead and compute an average and then pop that information into their results, into their data. We would then have to explain that process, and that's also part of academic integrity. So there's nothing wrong with doing that. There are certain ways that we do that in research that are acceptable in the field, but we have to explain those. And again, we have to provide a comprehensive report of the findings, including those that do not support our hypothesis. Again, going back to the integrity of explaining why insignificant findings, it's also important. We have to explicitly identify any potential confounding variables, so anything that may have led to a different result than we had anticipated. One of the examples I gave you was if we had one room was really hot, one section, one group of participants, and then the comparison group had a really, neutral temperature room. And we can say the confound was temperature, right? It may have influenced the results, but it was not the independent variable of interest. So we need to explain any potential confounds that may have influenced our results. Front matter, what we need, you will all need to include a title page. You can see the APA manual for style guide. For your dissertations, theses, you'll need a signature page. We don't need that here, but that is a part of a report. You'll need an abstract, which is a short summary of the entire study. That also is included in your assignment. Acknowledgements of assistance or support. That's always included in a dissertation or thesis, but not for this paper, and a table of contents also included for dissertations and theses, but again, not for this paper. Okay, so what's in the abstract? Here is just a brief summary of what the research project intended to accomplish, what research problem did it set out to address, what was the general design and methodology used in the study, what did you actually find, which again, of course, is not part of your proposal, so that won't be, but it would be in a final report, and conclusions, again, not in your proposal, but it would be in a final research report. Sometimes we need endnotes, not always, but there are times when you need them, if there are sources, permissions, any supplemental information, but again, not always. Reference list, you will all be completing an APA style reference list. Again, please see the APA manual for what to include here. It will depend on whether it's an electronic form or, if you went directly to the journal article in text. So please see the APA manual. There are so many different styles, and not styles, but formatting for different types of information, different types of sources. And then appendices. Here we'll need to include any appendices that were included in the study. So for example, let's say that we had a measure. So you had a scale that you used in your study, which you'll all have some type of measure. So then you'll have an appendix at the end that will include that actual scale. So you'll reference it in your method section and then say, please see Appendix A for the scale, and then I'd flip to the back appendix and find the actual scale and I can reference it. Writing the report, again, choose an appropriate style. The style for this course is APA style. Use a logical and predictable structure, add headings and transitions. Remember, those topic sentences at the beginning of the paragraph are important, and those, what I call segue sentences at the end, or the transition sentences at the end of each paragraph that help you segue into the next paragraph are really important. Be clear and precise, use appropriate verb tenses, and be consistent with that. Be objective and impartial. One of the other aspects is there's no I, there's no first person, no we. Whenever you're writing a research report, it's always in third person. Writing the research report, again, summarize regularly, submit a neat, clean final copy that strictly adheres to required formats. Again, if you have questions with that, please let me know. Develop a writing schedule. This is something that's also important, to break down the writing process into its subparts so that you're not, writing all of it at once. Identify small, easily accomplishable goals. Write easier sections first. That might depend on what you find is easier. Set reasonable target dates. So map it out, whatever works for you. Maybe reward yourself for reaching certain goals. Seek regular feedback, and that can be from me or from maybe someone else that a peer, having someone who you can work with on this is wonderful. You can read each other's drafts, and I had this when I was in my doctoral program, for example. I had, we called each other dissertation buddies, and we're still friends to this day, one of my best friends, and we went through that process together. It's one of those bonding moments that she read my dissertation, all the drafts, and I read hers, and we gave each other feedback. And sometimes when you're so in-depth into your own project, it's hard for you to see those little mistakes maybe that you missed, or you just need some fresh eyes on it. It's always good to have someone to work with on that. That's always nice. And plan for revisions. Do not see revisions as a setback. They are only helping you grow as you're in your writing process. Now, presenting, many of you who actually conduct studies may want to present your research at a conference. You know, whether it be in a poster format, there are APA-style posters, or an oral presentation. If you do complete your dissertation or thesis, that might be something that you're interested in. You would have to know which conferences are the ones in your field. For example, is it the APA organization, AERA, American Educational Research Association? So there are many different organizations depending on your discipline, and you may be interested in presenting those. It's also a great way to make connections and follow up after the conference. I know it's fun for me as I was going to some of these conferences to meet you know, some of the individuals who've contributed to my body of research, and just to talk to them about my project and talk to them more about their own projects. And you also see what's most current in your field. So going to professional conferences is really important to stay current in your own particular field. Additional writing advice: submit a report to a journal article. So if you feel like you have something that you want to contribute, you can write a report to a research journal. First, you want to review the criteria and expectations. Every journal is different in their expectations. You can share authorship when appropriate, so maybe you want to work with someone else on co-authoring it. And then seek and respond to reviewers' critiques as those come in. All right, that's it for Chapter 13 on how to write a research report. We talked about the elements of an entire research report as well as the ones that are specific to the assignments we have in this class. Again, if you have any other questions, please feel free to contact me.